The South, Slavery, and African American Culture, Part 3. A master could punish a slave family by selling enslaved people apart or by threatening to do so. Slave marriages were not recognized by the law. 1/3 of all slave marriages ended because the master sold husband or wife to a distant plantation. When slaves got married, their marriage vow was, "Till death or distance do us part." Slave men and women each faced their own particular hardships because of slavery. If you're a slave woman, you could be in a situation where you're forced to sleep with the master, to have sex with the master. Or maybe the master's teenage son decides he wants to try out his sexuality on you. If you're the slave woman in that situation, it's very difficult to resist. If you don't sleep with the master, you'll get punished. But the slave woman who then sleeps with the master, she becomes the target of the master's wife, because she's the other woman, and the master's wife will lash out against her in jealousy. And so if you're a slave woman and you're caught in this situation, you can't win. You sleep with the master, you'll get punished. You don't sleep with the master, you'll get punished. You're damned if you do and damned if you don't. Harriet Jacobs was a slave in North Carolina. I assign her autobiography in my Civil War class. She was in this exact situation. And she came to the conclusion that slavery was worse for women than it was for men because of this sexual dimension, and that the worst lot of all in slavery was to be a beautiful, physically attractive woman. You will have no peace. But slave husbands and fathers had their own hardships because of slavery. If you're a slave husband, you could be in a situation where your wife or your daughter is getting raped on a regular basis, and there's nothing you can do to prevent it. And remember, 19th century culture teaches that real men take care of their women. How's the enslaved man supposed to do that? Slave parents were powerless to keep their children from having to work, or to keep their children from being beaten or killed by the master. The slave parent has to stand there and watch the master beat your child. Or maybe the master has a 10-year-old brat who starts whipping your child. For slave parents, it's impossible to provide material comforts for your family, or an education, or any nice thing, no matter how hard you work. You can't provide an education or any nice things for your family. Well, the slave's response to slavery was, of course, resistance. And the resistance took a variety of forms. Sometimes slaves fought back. Sometimes they killed their masters. Sometimes they stole from their masters, broke tools, did lousy work, pretended to be sick, etc., etc. Sometimes slaves engaged in organized rebellion. Most slave rebellions never got past the planning stage because one slave would typically rat out the slaves who were planning a rebellion, and the masters rewarded slaves who did that. But some slave rebellions did take place. The most famous one took place in Virginia in 1831, a slave rebellion led by a slave named Nat Turner. In 1831, there was an eclipse of the sun, and that was a sign to Nat Turner to lead a slave rebellion. He and his followers rose up one night, and they went on a rampage, and they killed 55 white people before they were finally subdued. After Nat Turner, terror swept the white South. Whites lived in fear of slave rebellion, and whites really cracked down on slaves at that point. After the Nat Turner Rebellion, no more slaves carrying firearms. That's way too dangerous. Another form of resistance was slaves running away. Now, when the slaves ran away, there was a pattern to it. When the field hands ran away, they usually didn't get too far. they would be tracked down by bloodhounds and slave patrols, captured, returned back to the master, and punished severely. When George Washington's slaves got caught running away and were returned to him, he sold them to the West Indies. That's pretty much a death sentence. George Washington's neighbor was George Mason. When he caught a runaway slaves, he sliced their ears off. So the field hands, they usually don't get too far. But when the slave house servants and craftsmen ran away, they often ran away successfully, made it to the North, and were never recovered again by the master. How do you explain that pattern? Well, it's the house servants and the skilled artisans. Those are the ones who run away successfully because they have the right stuff to do it. Okay, the house servants, they wore nice clothes, they could pass for free blacks, they could often save up money and finance their own escape. House servants were often literate, and so they could read maps and road signs. They could forge a pass and sign their master's name to it in case they got stopped. They were often away from the plantation running errands. They could learn their way around and make contacts. And so it's the house servants and the skilled artisans who are most likely to run away successfully. They often were never reclaimed by the master. They made it to freedom in the North. The field hands typically did not. That's the pattern. Now, there's a whole variety of ways that slaves coped with their situation and retained a sense of worth and meaning and dignity in their lives. Slaves relied on their families and their communities. The slave family remained a strong institution against almost insurmountable odds. Enslaved people gave mutual aid and comfort to family members in hard times to pull each other through. That is, slaves would literally risk their lives to help one another escape. Now, students often assume that one slave family lived on one plantation, and that is not accurate. Often one family would be spread out over several plantations. Maybe you and your father live on this plantation, and your mother lives on that plantation a few miles away, and your sister lives on another plantation a few miles away. Well, why would that happen? Well, maybe slaves from two different plantations fell in love and got married. You don't always marry someone on your plantation. You might marry someone on another plantation. Maybe somebody misbehaved and was sold as a punishment. Or maybe the master simply needed cash to buy a new piano, and so off goes little sister for $300 to another plantation. Or how about when the master dies? Then all of the slaves need to be distributed to the heirs. Or maybe there's going to be an estate sale, as you can see here, and the slave families will be split up and go to new owners. Here's a picture of the Slave Mart in Charleston, South Carolina. This is where slaveholders would go to buy slaves. They would go to the Slave Mart and make their slave purchases. So think about what it takes to visit a loved one who lives on another plantation. You have to sneak away after dark, hike several miles perhaps, spend a couple hours in the middle of the night with your loved one, but you better be back on your plantation when the horn blows in the morning, or else it'll be the whipping post for you. Slave mothers and fathers struggled to fulfill their parental duties in spite of slavery, to pass on the culture, serve as role models, prepare their kids for adult life, teach them how to work in the fields, and outsmart the master. Now, how many of you, when you were kids, you read some of the Brer Rabbit stories? These are stories that come to us from African American slaves in the 19th century. What typically happens in a Brer Rabbit story is that a smart but weak animal, like Brer Rabbit, triumphs over a stronger but dumber animal, like Brer Bear or Brer Fox. The famous Tar Baby story is an example. These are stories that slave parents taught to slave children to educate them about a life in slavery. Now, on the plantation, you can't talk about smart slave and stupid master, and so you invent code and you talk about Brer Rabbit and Brer Bear. Slaves also coped through religion. Masters wanted to have religious slaves, because a religious slave is a nonviolent slave. A religious slave is an obedient slave. A religious slave will put up with this life and wait for a reward in the afterlife. And so the master made sure that there was a minister there every Sunday to preach to the slaves, and attendance at the slave worship services was mandatory. Here's an illustration of one of these slave worship services. The master's ministers would choose their texts from the Bible very, very carefully. Masters, or rather servants, obey your masters. Wait for your reward in the next life. The downtrodden are the chosen people of God. And there you can see the master and the mistress right there in the front pew of the church. Here's another one of these worship services, and again, master and mistress there in the front pew. And so the masters used the religion as social control to make the slaves obey. But what would happen is the slaves would take the master's Christian religion and use it as a source of strength against slavery. And so slaves would have their own worship services, maybe late at night, deep in the forest, and their own ministers, and they would have their own themes, David and Goliath, or Moses leading his people to freedom. And so what happens with religion is it becomes a double-edged sword. The master uses it one way to try to keep the slaves down. The slaves use it another way as a source of inspiration and strength against the institution of slavery. Slaves also coped with their slavery through artistic expression. One emotional outlet was music. Slaves sang songs to express sorrow. Song was a freedom of expression that whites could not suppress. And so slaves made the most of the few freedoms that were available to them. The bottom line, slavery was a very complex institution, and we've barely scratched the surface here in this presentation. It wasn't always a worst-case scenario. Some slaves had kind masters. Some slaves loved their masters. But enslaved people did not love slavery. And so they resisted it. And where they couldn't resist, they found other ways to cope, by relying on their families, their communities, their religion, and their artistic expression. Now, as you read Frederick Douglass, look for examples of some of the things that I have talked about in this presentation. I think you'll find many, many examples of all of the things that we talked about here in this presentation today.